Magnificent is the right word for these three objects. We now use it quite casually, but it is a word with a fascinating and distinguished history. What I want to do today is to explore the world of medieval magnificence and how the idea of magnificence was related specifically to medieval kingship. First, we need to look at the word itself, but I promise you that after that there will be a fine display of the objects and materials relating to magnificence. And there will be a gallery of the people involved in creating magnificence, from kings to cooks, from artists to musicians. Magnificence is a word coined by Aristotle in his book on ethics in the 4th century BC. Unlike his numerous volumes on natural science, the Ethics is concerned with the philosophy of human affairs. In it, he outlines a system of moral virtues which should guide our behavior. There are 11 virtues and, surprisingly to us today, the fourth of these virtues is magnificence, which consists in the doing of great things in a virtuous fashion. He offers, as his example, a wealthy, public-spirited Athenian citizen who spends his money on things for the common good, building temples or triremes or endowing theatre performances. To do this, a man must have money, as a poor man could not afford it, and he must be modest, for the object is not to display wealth, but to use it wisely. Aristotle sees magnificent actions as the hallmark of the personal virtue of magnificence.
Aristotle, with the rest of Greek learning, was forgotten in the early Middle Ages, when only a very few scholars could read Greek. It was not until the 13th century, in the early heady days of the University of Paris, that his ethics were studied again. His works on science were well known, but the Ethics were the last book to be translated into Latin. They presented a serious problem for the church authorities in charge of the university. Here was a moral system which owed nothing to the church. The new radical scholars argued that it was founded on reason, and reason was part of God's creation. This, they said, gave the Ethics authority in theological matters. The balance between these secular morals and the traditions of the Church occupied the greatest thinkers of the day, including the greatest of them, St. Thomas Aquinas. The arguments were fierce, and one of Aquinas' pupils, Giles of Rome, put forward a large number of radical propositions based on Aristotle in the 1270s. There was, inevitably, a backlash. In 1277, 219 propositions were condemned as heretical by the Archbishop of Paris, Etienne Tempier. Giles's name was attached to many of them, and he was forced to leave the university. It seems that Giles also had to leave Paris. So it is rather surprising that at some point in the next 7 years, the French king, Philip III, commissioned him to write a manual on how to govern for his son and heir, the future Philip IV. Giles's manual on the government of princes became a bestseller. It survives in over 300 manuscripts and was owned by many of the kings and princes of medieval Europe. It was widely influential on later writers, and yet there has been no printed edition since the early 17th century. Giles uses Aristotle's system of virtues as the framework of his book. He calls Aristotle simply the philosopher, as if he were the only one, and cites him endlessly. When it comes to the virtue of magnificence, Giles tells his royal pupil that it is crucial for the king to show magnificence in works for the common good, which affect the whole kingdom. Which is fair enough. However, he continues, it is the king's task to show magnificence towards his own person and towards persons close to him. This injunction is the key to the concept of magnificence in the 14th and 15th century. Before Giles of Rome, magnificence is a relatively rare word. By the end of the 15th century, magnificence is everywhere. Following his advice, many kings chose to make the splendor of their appearance, their entourage and their surroundings their first priority. As Thomas Hardy put it, who seems most kingly is the king. So first of all, we will look at the person of the king. Here, Richard II offers us a lesson in magnificence, in a portrait larger than life size, now in Westminster Abbey. The scholars of Paris were not the only people who read Aristotle. Alfonso X of Spain wrote a massive treatise on law in about 1265, which is in fact a fascinating guide to the whole of Spanish society. Alfonso tells us that the ancient sages established the rule that kings should wear garments of silk, adorned with gold and jewels, in order that men might know them as soon as they saw them. Alfonso had already put laws into place ensuring that no one except the royal family could appear in this kind of clothing. By an extraordinary chance, garments belonging to Alfonso's son Fernando have survived, preserved in the royal tombs in the monastery of Las Huelgas at Burgos. The embroidered cap and belt give a very good idea of the brilliant colours of royal dress. The cut of Fernando's mantle is that of a simple tunic, and clothing of the late 13th century relied heavily on the richness of the materials and of the embroidery. By the following century, a much more elaborate and lavish style had come into fashion. Alas, only fragments of such garments survive. For example, Edward III's Christmas gown in 1337 survives in a description from the royal accounts, where the chancery clerks obviously revelled in the chance to include all the details. The hood alone depicted tigers holding court made from pearls and embossed with silver and gold, with a castle and a man riding towards it. Moreover, between each tiger a tree of pearls and a tree of gold. This is one of the rare pictures of a king showing a rich embroidered gown from England at this period, with a very avant-garde pattern. It is itself an embroidery on an English ecclesiastical cope dating to around 1320. In the early 14th century, the invention of the sleeve and of buttons revolutionized the possibilities of dress. Instead of loose cloaks and tunics, later royal clothing is distinguished by fashion and design. By the middle of the century, these fashions could be extreme. This is an image of Louis, a member of the French ducal family of Anjou, who claimed to be king of Sicily and Jerusalem. He married Joanna, Queen of Naples, in 1352. It comes from the statutes of the Order of the Holy Ghost, which he founded the following year. The length of the hood and the totally impractical sleeves are combined with a body-hugging short tunic made of white samite. Samite was a cloth particularly reserved for kings and bishops, but the style of the dress is that of a fashionable courtier. At the same time, exotic materials were imported from as far afield as China. Chinese silk had been found in a London excavation dated to around 1325, and a Chinese silk woven with dragons and serpents was part of the trousseau of Edward III's daughter Joan in 1348. A similar material in blue and gold appears in the Wilton diptych, painted in the last quarter of the 14th century. There are 3 richly dressed saints, and the wearer of the silk is Edmund, one of Richard II's patron saints. At the same time, exotic materials were imported from as far afield as China. Chinese silk had been found in a London excavation dated to around 1325, and a Chinese silk woven with dragons and serpents was part of the trousseau of Edward III's daughter Joan in 1348. A similar material in blue and gold appears in the Wilton diptych, painted in the last quarter of the 14th century. There are 3 richly dressed saints, and the wearer of the silk is Edmund, one of Richard II's patron saints. Next, we look at portraits. The first realistic portraits of kings are surprisingly late. If you saw someone dressed magnificently, he was probably a king. But how did you know which king? Magnificence alone did not enable you to identify an important person you had never seen before. Portraits, in the broadest sense, are the modern way by which we identify people we don't know. But it is not until the early 14th century in Italy that portraits appear as realistic images. This picture of Robert I of Naples is part of an altarpiece by Simone Martini of about 1317. The image of John II of France is also probably the work of an Italian painter 2 decades later. We now know that Charles V of France had portraits of his uncle, the Emperor Karl IV, his father John II, and Edward III of England, on a folding panel in his study, so that the idea of the portrait painting was firmly established by then. Now we come to the most important figure in today's talk. Karl IV, as Holy Roman Emperor from 1348 to 1378, ruled domains which stretched from the Baltic to the Adriatic and from the eastern edge of Christian Europe to the French border. He seems to have used portraits as a methodical means of making himself familiar to his subjects. No less than 70 portraits of him survive. Here are just 2 of them. Karl can't be described as handsome. He had a long, bulbous nose, heavy eyebrows, and a generally slightly uncouth expression. But it is an unmistakable face. Karl IV was a remarkable character. Brought up in the French court, his mother was a French princess, he was tutored by Pierre Roger, a famous theologian who became Pope Clement VII. He was crowned 5 times, twice as King of the Romans, as King of Bohemia, as King of Lombardy, and finally as Emperor. He was a successful general, an astute politician, and a deeply religious man who wrote his autobiography at the age of 33. The ideal of magnificence extended to the king's surroundings, to his family, to his court and courtiers, to his artists and musicians, to the whole ambience of royalty. Magnificent buildings, such as castles and palaces, which Aristotle would have acknowledged, were still included, but as an aspect of the king's personal prestige. Everything about the king's family, his companions, his surroundings, and even his personal beliefs could contribute to his magnificence, which in turn reinforced his position and prestige. Karl IV, as Holy Roman Emperor, represents the magnificence of an established ruler. Bohemia, his kingdom, was at the heart of his operations. When Karl first came to Prague in 1333 as his father's deputy, it was the modest capital of a small country, with a palace in ruins. As emperor, Karl made it into an imperial city. He founded a new town larger than the existing capital. He endowed it with a university, and he rebuilt both the palace and the cathedral on the Hradčany hill which overlooked the city. The plan for the new town included a processional way leading from the southern entrance to the Hradčany. Processions might be held when the emperor returned to his city or when he displayed a new addition to his religious treasury. This treasury became an extraordinary collection of over 600 saints' relics during the course of his reign. When he acquired the body of Saint Vitus, the patron saint of Bohemia, from the town of Pavia in 1355, he sent a triumphal letter to Prague announcing its forthcoming arrival there, and it was duly borne in procession along this route. The most spectacular event was the procession displaying the imperial regalia when Karl acquired them in 1350. The imperial crown was both symbolically and visually the most dramatic. Nearly 400 years old, it had been remodelled in various ways. The base was, and is, essentially in its original form. It owes something to Byzantine crowns, notably the enamel plaques on 4 sides. This picture shows the front of the crown, with the most massive of the jewels. The arch and the cross were added in the 11th century. The basic structure is 8 plates, with pinned hinges so that it can be taken apart. One day, I would love to give a talk entirely on the imperial mantle, added to the regalia by Frederick II in the 13th century. In brief, it was made for his ancestor, King Roger II, in Sicily by Arab embroiderers, who left a note of their names and the date, 1133, inside the lining. This was only discovered during a late 20th century restoration. The two lions attacking camels symbolize the Norman conquest of Sicily, and a Byzantine-style clasp at the top has patterns representing the relationship of the heavens and the earth. It was used at imperial coronations until the 15th century. A replica was then made, and the original carefully preserved. If Prague is his public monument, Karlstein is Karl's private place. It is magnificent in a different way, a fabled treasure house to which only the very privileged were allowed access. The castle began as a summer retreat and then housed the imperial regalia before becoming a very focused religious centre. The two massive towers at the heart of the castle are perhaps reminiscent of the imperial treasury at Trifels in the Rhineland in their design security. The journey, which takes the visitor from the secular apartments at the foot of the tower to the Chapel of the Holy Cross, is dramatic. The first staircase leads to the quarters of the College of Canons, whom Karl had established there to serve his new sanctuary. Their chapel is relatively spacious, and wall paintings here depict Karl being given relics by the kings of France and Cyprus. In the right-hand image, he puts these gifts into the Holy Cross, specially designed to hold all the relics from the crucifixion in his collection. From the chapel tower, a narrow wooden bridge leads to the only entry to the main tower. The staircases now become narrow, though they are brilliant with wall paintings honouring the royal dynasty and Karl's favourite saints. As you mount the stairs, the ceiling colour changes first from red to blue, and then from blue to the starry deep blue vault of heaven, before we come to the entrance of the Holy Cross Chapel. This is a space which has to be experienced. It is almost impossible to provide an adequate two-dimensional image of it. The entry is made all the more dramatic by a small airlock chamber before you step into this dazzling space of gold and semi-precious stones. Hosts of the saints and holy kings and queens look down from the walls, most of them the work of Master Theodoric, whose dramatic style is unlike anything in contemporary Europe. This is Theodoric's dramatic image of St. George, patron saint of chivalry. St. George is perhaps looking in horror at the dragon he has just slain. The head of the dragon, in fact a crocodile's head, was among the most precious of Karl's relics. Magnificence sometimes led to direct competition. This was particularly true of France at the end of the 14th century. Within the space of 4 years, from 1377 to 1380, Edward III, Karl IV and Charles V, the three greatest rulers in Europe, all died. By the end of the century, both Richard II of England and Wenceslaus, heir to the empire, had been deposed. Charles VI of France was 12 when his father died, leaving the royal finances in a healthy state. He was excessively fond of festivals and tournaments, and planned a lavish ceremonial for the coronation of his wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, at Notre Dame in 1389. The chronicler, Jean Froissart, went specially to Paris to see it. This is a later miniature, but it shows accurately the citizens of Paris in their uniforms of red and green, and the Queen borne on a litter. Charles VI went mad on August 25, 1392, when he was leading his army on campaign. Startled by a sudden noise, he believed he was under attack and drew his sword, killing 5 men and wounding his brother, the Duke of Orléans. He recovered, but the illness recurred the following year. The king imagined himself as made of glass and liable to shatter at any moment. It was a madness which recurred at intervals until the end of his life. Isabeau became Queen Regent, and she therefore assumed the king's role of magnificence. Isabeau undoubtedly loved rich dress and spent substantial amounts on clothes. She encouraged new fashions for women, such as wearing the male houppelande, a long gown with flared sleeves and a trailing skirt. Philip the Bold, one of the dukes on the Regency Council, had worn a spectacular version of the houppelande, of cloth of gold with 7 spiral ribbons of different colours running round the body for a festival in 1398. Isabeau also introduced new hairstyles, satirised by the poet Eustache de Champs as Harry Bourrin. These evolved into the horned headdress known as the hennin. The hennin is shown in this picture of Isabeau with the poet Christine de Pizan. It was perhaps not surprising that her magnificence combined with her love of fashion should lead to attacks on her by her opponents for extravagance. However, it is noticeable that magnificence was never seen as extravagance when practiced by male rulers. From the beginning of Charles's reign, the French royal accounts record New Year's gifts on an extraordinary scale. New Year gifts go back to the gifts exchanged by the Romans at the New Year, and there are records of relatively modest gifts of this kind in Edward III's court. These are nothing to what was happening in the French court. The illustration for the month of January in the famous Très Riches Heures of John Duke of Berry has been interpreted recently as showing the Duke's clients queuing up to offer him presents, while his court fool encourages them with cries of "Approche, approche! Come on, come on!" Between 1401 and 1416, the royal accounts report 7,000 gifts, totalling £500,000 Tournois pounds, or rather more than the annual income of the Duke of Burgundy at the time. Sadly, little of the jewellery, which was the usual form of such offerings, survives, because it was so often treated as a form of bullion and melted down. The precious stones were put into store for reuse. By 1422, when Charles VI died, the French treasury was exhausted, and this was when many pieces of goldsmiths' work disappeared into the furnaces to pay for the costs of the war. The one surviving masterpiece, and the French goldsmiths of the period were unsurpassed in their skills, is the so-called Little Golden Horse. This was given by Isabeau to Charles VI in 1400. The king kneels on the left with his heraldic beast, the tiger, at his side. On the right, his squire holds his helmet. Below, the royal groom waits with the king's horse, a harmony of gold and white. The enamelling on the sweeping curves of the clothing was a new technique. Behind the Virgin and Child, a riot of jewels represents the Rose Garden, which was the fashionable background for images of Mary and her son in the late Middle Ages. An intense rivalry developed between the dukes on the council, and Isabeau had a difficult course to steer. This rivalry became a kind of competition in magnificence. Personal badges were in fashion as a means of identifying followers. When one duke adopted a knotty club as his badge, his rival adopted a carpenter's plane, saying he would remove the knots on his rival's club with it. This illustration shows the king reclining on a daybed. His dress has a pattern of peacock feathers, one of his badges, and the bed has another, sprigs of broom. Around the top is his motto, jamais, never. The ferocity of the quarrels between the regents was such that 2 of them were assassinated, first the Duke of Orleans in 1407 by John the Fearless of Burgundy, and the latter in revenge in 1419. The frontispiece to a pamphlet supporting John the Fearless shows their heraldic animals fighting in front of the royal tent. The wolf, Orleans, is struck down by the lion, Burgundy. The growing power of Burgundy gave rise to a new use for magnificence: dukes' ambitions to be kings. We can trace the development of Burgundy as a major European power through a series of maps. We begin with the lands which were given to Philip the Bold when he became Duke of Burgundy in 1363. 6 years later, he married Margaret, Countess of Flanders, and they ruled their extensive domains until 1405. John the Fearless inherited his parents' land in that year and added a small amount of territory before he was murdered in 1419. Philip the Good succeeded him, and during his lifetime the Burgundian state was extended by purchases and even leases. It was governed from Brussels and Dijon. Charles the Bold fought a series of military campaigns, but was largely unable to hold on to the lands which he acquired by force, and met his death at the hands of the Swiss and their allies at Nancy in 1477. The rise of the Duchy of Burgundy was made possible by the weakness of the French crown, particularly during the English rule from Paris in the name of Henry VI. Philip the Good had the most admired court in Europe by 1450. John Paston was sent on an embassy there in 1468. His awed description to his mother back in rural Suffolk is typical of the response of visitors. As for the Duke's court, I never heard of one like it for lords, ladies, and gentlewomen, knights, squires, and gentlemen, except for King Arthur's court. Indeed, we know a great deal about the workings memory to write to you of half the memoirs of Olivier de la Marche, who began as a page and rose to become master of ceremonies to Philip and his son Charles. He wrote a description of Charles the Bold's household, as well as lengthy accounts of the marriage of Charles and Margaret of York, and of 3 of the great feasts held by Philip. In all the wonderful miniatures in medieval manuscripts, I only know of a single one which really gives something of the feel of a great medieval feast. It depicts that held in honour of Karl IV in Paris in 1378. This shows one of the chief features of such occasions. Between the courses of the feast, there were interludes. Originally, these were dumb shows, or perhaps the appearance of a dragon or monster. Later, they became dramatic interludes, and on this occasion the siege of Jerusalem in 1099 was reenacted. There were 2 scenes. Confusingly, they appear simultaneously in the picture. On the left, the Crusaders disembark, and on the right, Jerusalem is taken by storm. The most famous feast of all took place in 1454. This was the Feast of the Pheasant, intended as the apogee of Philip the Good's achievements. It was to be the prelude to a full-scale crusade. Like many medieval European rulers, a crusade was seen as the ultimate achievement. Philip the Good had an additional motive, revenge for the disaster at Nicopolis in 1396. This had led to his father John being captured by the Muslim. But there is no visual record of the feast. We have descriptions of the interludes, but we have to imagine the moment when a figure representing Jerusalem entered the hall on the back of an elephant and sang a countertenor aria lamenting the city's fate. That figure is said to have been Olivier de la Marche himself. On the tables were other musicians, an entire choir in a chapel, and a pasty full of fiddle players, probably the 24 blackbirds of the English nursery rhyme. The event culminated with the guests taking their crusading vows. An essential part of any feast was a massive display of the Duke's silver and gold plate on the buffet. A modest example of a buffet is top left. The other items are samples of what would have been on it. This is a pale shadow of the buffet which Olivier de la Marche describes at the wedding of Charles the Bold and Margaret of York in 1468. In the middle of the hall was a high and rich buffet, in the shape of a lozenge. The base of the buffet was enclosed like the lists in a tournament, and the whole of it was covered in tapestry with the Duke's arms. From the base upwards there were steps loaded with plate, with the largest pieces at the bottom, and the richest and most delicate at the top. So at the bottom were the great silver gilt pieces, and at the top were the gold pieces set with jewels, of which there were a great many. And at the very top of the buffet there was a rich jewelled cup, and on the corners there were large unicorn's horns, very large and beautiful. And none of the plate on the buffet was used to serve food that day. Such lavish occasions reflected the way in which Burgundy had been transformed into a major power. Philip the Good, the chief architect of this change, was certainly regarded as the equal of kings in power and influence. In 1430, he founded the Order of the Golden Fleece, which was soon regarded as the most prestigious knightly order after the Order of the Garter. In 1447, the Emperor Frederick III, anxious to obtain his support, suggested that he might become King of Brabant, while remaining technically a vassal of the empire, but nothing came of it. Such lavish occasions reflected the way in which Burgundy had been transformed into a major power. Philip the Good, the chief architect of this change, was certainly regarded as the equal of kings in power and influence. In 1430, he founded the Order of the Golden Fleece, which was soon regarded as the most prestigious knightly order after the Order of the Garter. In 1447, the Emperor Frederick III, anxious to obtain his support, suggested that he might become King of Brabant, while remaining technically a vassal of the empire, but nothing came of it. Philip bequeathed his ambition to become a king to his son Charles. Charles renewed the idea of a royal title granted by the emperor, but in a much more grandiose form. He suggested to the Emperor Frederick III that his only child, Mary, would marry Maximilian, Frederick III's son. In return, Charles would become king of the Romans and would inherit the empire. At the same time, Maximilian would become king of the Romans. Maximilian would then succeed both to the imperial title and to the Burgundian lands on Charles's death. Duke and Emperor met at Trier on the 30th of September 1473. Frederick had rejected the scheme, but Charles set out to dazzle him, and indeed the whole of Europe, with a display of spectacular magnificence. This, he hoped, would persuade Frederick to change his mind. He arrived with a retinue of over 1,000 men, in the most luxurious livery. The total cost of the clothing alone was almost £39,900. 7 days after his arrival, he gave a feast on an equally lavish scale, which even in an age of extravagant entertainment made a huge impression on those who took part in it. A small book on the magnificence of Burgundy, written by an eyewitness, was so much in demand that it was quickly translated from Latin into German and Dutch. At the feast which Charles gave in the emperor's honour, seen in this rather homely illustration by a Swiss chronicler, there were 3 tables, and everything on them was of gold and of silver. His Imperial Majesty sat in the middle of the first table and, on his right, the Archbishop of Mainz, the Archbishop of Trier, the Bishop of Liège, and the Bishop of Utrecht. On the other side sat the high-born Prince Duke Charles of Burgundy, Maximilian, Archduke of Austria, the Emperor's son, and the 3 Dukes of Bavaria. In the first place, 13 dishes were presented and served, ushered in by 16 trumpeters and 12 princes dressed in cloth of gold. Beside these 12 princes were another 100 princes, lords, knights, and noblemen, all clad in cloth of gold and silver, each according to his rank. Frederick III was not susceptible to this kind of display. By the 23rd of October, Charles realized he was getting nowhere, lowered his sights, and demanded merely important concessions from the emperor. This was in public. In private, Frederick reluctantly offered to make the county of Burgundy a kingdom. Preparations were made for the emperor to crown Charles at Trier itself before the end of November. But it all came to a sudden end. Frederick III announced on the 24th of November that he was leaving immediately. One of Charles's councillors tried to delay him so that the Duke could bid him farewell. The emperor waited on his galley for half an hour for him to appear and then ordered his rowers to start. This diplomatic insult, to the great shame and humiliation of the Duke, caused a deep rift between the 2 countries. The Germans were offended by the pompous and ceremonious language of the Duke, which they took for pride. The Burgundians were offended by the emperor's entourage and poor clothes. Ducal magnificence was less powerful than imperial intransigence. Throughout these negotiations, Charles was making plans to rebury his parents, Philip the Good and Isabel, in the mausoleum which his father had created at Champmont near Dijon. This ceremony was probably seen and remembered by more people than any other event during the existence of the medieval Duchy of Burgundy. It involved journeys from Bruges and northern France of a total of 870 kilometres. The bodies were taken in solemn procession from Bruges and from Gosnay in northeast France, with torches blazing, a military escort and chanting monks walking alongside. Bells were rung in every place through which they passed on their journey. The cortege struggled through torrential rain and floods which twice halted the procession. The costs of the reburial were huge, and a vast number of people were involved. At each stop, hundreds of candles were used, on occasion perhaps as many as 1,000. There were formal entries into towns such as Namur and Valenciennes, and Dijon itself. In these and other towns, elaborate structures called burning chapels or catafalques, with heraldic devices, were erected in the churches. Surrounded by candle flames, the coffins were laid on them overnight. Why should the reburial, which had long been planned, suddenly be put into effect, postponed several times and then carried out in the depths of winter? The clue is that the operation was originally to have begun on November 20th, 2 days after the date set in the negotiations at Trier for the coronation of Charles as King of Burgundy. The event could not be cancelled, but it was delayed repeatedly from day to day when things went wrong. The journey finally began on the 2nd of January. The intention had been that it should be Charles's first royal act. Unexpected as the form of this magnificence seems, it was actually one of the most effective in terms of the number of spectators who saw this display of propaganda. If it had been combined with his coronation, it would have been a truly dramatic opening to his reign. 4 years later, Charles lived up to his nickname, usually translated as the Bold. The French word is téméraire, as in temerity, and it implies foolhardiness. He had got entangled in a war with the Swiss, and outside Nancy in January 1477, he attacked the army of the Swiss and their allies with 5,000 men. The enemy outnumbered Charles's men by at least 4-1, and the conclusion was to be expected. But the rout was so chaotic that it took 2 days to find the Duke's mangled body. The Burgundian court chronicler remembered Charles by his 12 magnificences. Even these were soon superseded. 7 months later, Maximilian married Mary, now Duchess of Burgundy, and Burgundy itself was absorbed into the Habsburg Empire. Medieval magnificence gave way to the very different style of magnificence of the Italian Renaissance, but that is another story.